In nomine Patris, et Filii, et Spiritus Sancti. Amen. Ave Maria, gratia plena, Dominus tecum, benedicta tu in mulieribus, et benedictus fructus ventris tui, Iesus.
Sancta Maria, Mater Dei, ora pro nobis peccatoribus, nunc et in hora mortis nostrae. Amen.
In nomine Patris, et Filii, et Spiritus Sancti. Amen. Brethren in Christ, laudetur Jesus Christus.
In secula.
This is Timothy Flanders with the meaning of Catholic. Jesus is King. You are listening or watching the Terror of Demons morning show with Kennedy Hall. How you doing, brother?
Living the dream. I just realized my my microphone was the wrong one, so now that sounds better.
Oh, sounds good now. Excellent. Well, we are welcome to the first week of Advent. It's a wonderful time of year right now. You got snow on the ground in the wonderful world of Marxist
Utopia.
Canada.
Yeah, it's a lot of climate change on the ground right now.
Oh yeah, we got it here in the great state of Michigan as well. Jeremiah could not join us. He had fatherly duties to attend to, so he's taking care of business at home. We've got let me see. So we're really excited at the Flanders household because we've got Liturgy the Home.
Mm-hmm.
Make sure you check out liturgythehome.com if you want this beautiful calendar for your kids. So we've got first Sunday of Advent, the prophecy of the second coming. As you may know, Advent is all about the comings of our Lord Jesus Christ, coming in the flesh and coming at the end of time. Go to 1peter5.com for a series on the four last things from Kennedy Hall. I think it's up right now. It's the featured article. Death, judgment, heaven, and hell. Great time to reflect on these things. And it's not too late to do penance and join in the St. Martin's fast, of course. So we've got today, Feria Day of Advent. Tomorrow's the Feast of St. Andrew. Make sure you start your novena, St. Andrew novena. Let's see. St. Bibiana on Thursday. St. Francis Xavier, I love those early Jesuits. They're the best.
They were awesome. I mean, it's
wonderful.
the Jesuits were so good. It's such a shame that things have happened.
Yeah, I mean, Jesuits were good. When they were good, they were good.
They were unbelievably good. You know,
I mean, they don't even start to be really that bad until after the 1920s and 30s, 40s maybe. Like the 1940s, Jesuits in France are bad, but you still have awesome German.
But even
Irish
then, they
Jesuits.
were bad in a way that our bad guys aren't even good today. Like they were, how should I put this? They were they were so intelligent. I guess that's sort of the downfall of. I remember reading an article about the Jesuits on 1 Peter 5 like 2 or 3 years ago, saying they had to be suppressed and stuff. And I get that, but I really would love them to be reformed because their formation and their commitment to just being like the smartest people on the face of the planet really made some excellent theologians. But anyway.
Yeah, we've got TRN/ says, I owe a lot to St. Xavier because he's actually in India.
Oh, that's right. We've
got one of our viewers in Trinidad, Francis in Trinidad. Welcome, brother. And TRN/ is in India because, as you may know, St. Francis Xavier went to India.
My son's middle name is Xavier.
Oh, that's wonderful.
Titus Xavier.
Yeah, it was just my friend Rafael Xavier Gonzalez. He was telling me that
Javier.
Yeah, there we go. St. Francis Xavier was reflecting how there is a greater zeal among worldlings than the parable of the shrewd servant as the shrewd merchant. Because St. Francis Xavier got to India and there were these European merchants there before him. And so he was reflecting on how we're not even that zealous. The worldlings or the sinners are more zealous for sin than we are for virtue. So it's a good reflection. So St. Peter Chrysologos as well on Saturday. And we also have, let's see, the Soviet Republic of Ireland also represented this morning. No Aussies yet.
I haven't heard that yet. Soviet. That's amazing. I'm going to use that. I'm going to steal that. Sorry. I'm not going to say. I'm going to. What's the person's name that I can give them?
Mark Brown.
Yeah. Mark Brown. Okay. I got to make sure I give credit when I say it on the radio later.
Wonderful. Yeah, that's great. Kobe. Perfect. So yeah, we have a wonderful week planned at Meaning of Catholic. This is very much Eastern Orthodox week at Meaning of Catholic. Tonight we have Michael Lofton. We're talking about Eastern Orthodoxy and magisterial reversals. We'll talk about a little bit about Michael Lofton's time as an Eastern Orthodox, as well as myself, and one of the key factors that brought us to Rome, which is the magisterium. And then on Wednesday we have a Jewish convert from Eastern Orthodoxy to Catholicism. That's the Byzantine Scotist, continuing our series of the error of no salvation outside Thomism. And then on the credit to Kennedy for that wonderful phrase. And on Friday, I will be appearing on Craig Trulia's show. He's an Eastern Orthodox Christian.
You've had him on before, right?
Yeah, he's been on our show before. Yeah.
Yeah.
Craig Trulia, he's a good guy. He's a friend, Eastern Orthodox. He's got a channel called Orthodox Christian Theology. So we'll just kind of be doing a little back and forth on the schism and East-West and all that stuff. That's Friday night. And then Thursday, God willing, will be my article at 1 Peter 5 explaining why I still do not regret coming to Rome after 2 years under Francis and now Traditionis Custode. So that'll be 1 Peter 5. We'll be doing an ongoing series against the Greek schisms, discussing this as objectively as we can. And then Tuesday will be the English Catholic Soul Part 2 with Monday Radio. And then last but not least, we have our Thursday patron-only show is Jews, Judaism, and Israel, History of the People. And I'll be discussing my time as a Messianic Jew and all that fun stuff. So you can get the new book at the link below, City of God versus City of Man. That is linked below. So Kennedy, what's going on with the Kennedy profession? Any news from you?
Just ramping up for Advent. We're going to have Dr. Maza on, Dr. Maza, and he does a really fun Yiddish accent. Has he ever done that for you when he does his like Yiddish thing?
He has a lot of accents. He's
hilarious. And I'm going to have him on the next couple of weeks. I want him to answer a bunch of questions. Particularly, I've been, as you know, reading on this show and stuff, but I've just been reading a lot of English, like Chestertonian era English stuff, politics and religion from Catholics. And I'm just trying to get to the bottom of the way this word liberal has been used. Because I just find so many people using it differently. And I don't know. I think it's fascinating. I read an article from the former editor of Crisis, Warren Davies or something.
Yeah.
I don't know anything about if people don't like him or not. I have no idea what he's written beyond this article. But it was just a fascinating article talking about English Catholics and British politics and things. And just it was fascinating. So I want to talk to Dr. Maza about all things historical that have to do with that, because he is the expert on that sort of stuff. So he'll be on soon. And then there's just headlines. It's daily news. So sometimes I don't know what we're going to talk about until 1:30 in the afternoon, because, you know, like the Kyle Rittenhouse trial breaks and it's like, well, we got to talk about that now, or whatever's going on. Right. So stay tuned for that.
Yeah. So sign up for the Kennedy profession. That's linked below as well. So we're continuing our discussion back and forth about libertarianism, liberalism. And we ended last show with Jeremiah read some quote that I think it was from Pius XI, Quadragesimo Anno, I think, where he was critiquing the modern state in the sense that it basically, the modern state and the liberal state, liberal order, liberal economic order, which basically divides society down to the individual. It creates individualism. It creates a massive cutthroat competition and greed, etc., which results in communism, etc. Something to that effect. And Kennedy, you agreed with that critique. Because I want to. Do you recall some of that critique that he said?
Well, I know he mentioned a citation from Pius XI talking about the unregulated economy. and how that was always a failure. That's what he said.
Okay, so you would
That's
agree
the
that an
context.
unregulated economy is a failure or going to be a failure?
Well, yeah. So this is something I wanted to bring up. I watched a really fun debate between, and it was fun in like the good sense. It was between Joseph Pierce, who I adore. I love his work. I really do. Like he's a rare bird in Catholic. I don't know, Catholic apologists, or what do you call him? Just a Catholic intellectual. You know, he is very much in the vein of Chesterton and Belloc in the sense that he's kind of a Renaissance man. He can talk about 100 different things and be an expert in all of them. And he was debating Jay Richards, and it
Yeah,
was
I've seen
actually,
that.
yeah, it was good. I mean, it was. It was good. It was a good debate.
Gentlemanly.
It was,
Yes.
and it was fun, and it was
Yeah.
smart, and Father Sirico did a really good job of moderating it, and like the true sense of being a moderator. Anyway, a couple things. I realized this is what I've been thinking for a while. The I don't know which one to call it. Let's just use this term distributist or integralist, just for sake of categorizing a type of thought. Okay, because I know
Okay.
it's more complicated than that, but just in that sense. And the libertarian or Austrian. And I should add to the Austrian approach to economics is not necessarily the same as the libertarian approach to government. There are a lot of differences between people who sympathize with some subset of those ideas. So, but I'll use them interchangeably here just for the sake of categorizing the general conversation. Anyway, so it was sort of the free market idea versus the distributist or integralist sort of idea. And there are moments when the folks of both persuasions are talking about different things, but they think they're talking about the same thing. There's an element of talking past each other that I've realized. And there was a moment in their conversation, which I think was indicative of this. And it will come down to what we'll talk about with sort of like, what is the state and how do we understand the state? Because that's sort of, it's kind of like, this debate since the Second Vatican Council. I never understood this until I finally understood it, was when Lefebvre would talk about the major issue that goes unseen is the difference in ecclesiology. What you believe the church is will change how you act within the church. That's kind of how he meant that, which I think is true. And it'll come down to what you believe the state is will change about how you view how the state should act, sort of. So anyway, they were talking about an example. Jay Richards had asked Pierce to give an example of how a distributist or let's call it interventionist, not in a pejorative sense, but just the government intervened in some sort of economic thing to help small business, family business, individual business, whatever, just subsidiarity based mentality. And he used an example in England of, apparently in England, there are 4 major brewers, like whatever they are. They own 90% of the pubs. If anyone's watched the debate, they'll know this. So I'll just say it quickly. And so they own 90% of the pubs. So basically, they just won't let microbrewers sell their beer in the pubs. That was what it was. So it was hard for the little man to get in, right? Which is a monopoly type thing par excellence, which is not conducive to any thriving or competition. That's not even in the free market idea. A monopoly like that is not good because there's no competition. So Pierce basically said the government, there was a private members bill. They stepped in, somebody introduced the bill, and the government passed a law where every pub had to have a guest ale. And this was really great for the pubs or for the microbrewers because now 2,000 pubs across the country, whatever. It's England, so it's probably 15,000, whatever the number is. They had to have a thing. And that was great. And he gave success stories of how it helped, it meant selling these microbrews, whatever. It was great.
Yeah.
But then the one thing that Jay Richards was trying to say to him is like, well, I agree with you that it was wrong that, or I agree with you that it was good for those businesses that they were allowed to now sell their beer. But that wasn't an act of government. That was a retraction of government. So he was like, what would help make sure that never happens is if there were no regulations around alcohol. Like, why is it that you could only sell your beer at a pub anyway? That was the point he was trying to make, is the reason why there was a monopoly is because selling the beer was tied to regulations and ownership of these places that you had to buy with licenses in the first place. So,
so let me just break this down. You're saying that a monopoly, so the big business, the bad big business that, that creates this power,
that crony thing
in the market,
yeah,
is created through what libertarians would call crony capitalism, which is where they leverage their power to get various laws and regulations to keep out their competitors.
That's what because here's the thing, all businesses, we use this term economic law and people get upset about that. What the Austrians mean when they talk about an economic law is that there's just an observed fact that you see at all times and in all places by all peoples, and there's a general application of that, and then there are exceptions. So that's what we mean by law. Not that it's a law of chemistry where it always has to be a certain way. It's just a general, this is, as a rule, human beings act in a certain way. It's just sort of a characteristic of mankind. That's what they mean when they say the economy has laws in that way. So as a law of economics, essentially, monopolies always end up breaking apart on their own at the point when they're most excessive. The reason being for that is, takes, let's say, 20, 30 years for a monopoly to brew, okay? During that time, usually what happens is there's someone, unless there's government intervention, this is the thing. If there's government intervention, monopolies are an artificial thing because government itself is kind of a monopoly, so it can help form other ones. But if you leave it unfettered, there will always be, for at least a time, especially in the economies that we have with, global access to things, there will be for a time someone who's the big dog, especially when it comes to an invention. It's like, if Tim goes and invents the, I don't know, you invent some amazing app for Catholics and it's like the only one. Well, you'll be the only one. Like, you will have a monopoly on that app. 10, 15 years down the road, eventually people will either get tired of using your app, or there will be people that worked for you that gain the expertise to make their own apps. They'll make something similar. It's just sort of the way it goes. So if the government does not prop up a monopoly, which they often do, the monopolies will eventually bifurcate into something else. We've seen this. As bad as big tech can be, or as annoying they can be, what you actually see with a lot of the big tech companies is, this is why you see multiple cell phone companies, where it's like, for a time it was only Apple, and then there was a little bit of Android, and now, I mean, it's to the point where the products are basically ubiquitous amongst various different cell phone companies, and they all, that's just one of the ways that you could say, do they have a monopoly? Well, they definitely do, insofar as they have the technology, but no one else developed it. You give it 15 or 20 years, then other people learn the technology, and then they make their own versions of it. So what I've realized, this whole reason is to say, what I've realized with the way that the different sides are speaking to each other is, the free marketeer says, that's great. I'm glad they found a way to get more competition. But the point is, they didn't have the competition because of the interventionism in the first place. But there's watching both of them talk, it was like this wall was there. It was something that Joseph Pierce, it didn't register. I'm not saying that in a sense where he couldn't understand it. They have a different concept of, I believe, what the state is supposed to do. So they couldn't imagine a world without it.
Okay. See, I would want to frame this discussion as like you talked about Luis Molina. Like, I think of the Jesuit reduction economies that were developed in South America, and that type of an economy, which is basically, it is innovative, but it is an integrated economy that it organically grows for the local family and the local growers and everybody, and it's sustainable in the good way, and it's stable in the good way, because it just provides what they need, and it's basically a spirit of cooperation, even though there is there's a competitive element, because in the Christian spirit there is a competition for virtue, in the sense that everyone's trying to be virtuous, and
there's always both.
And so everybody's competing and cooperating at the same time. There's sort of a both and there. And so these, like Joseph Pierce was saying in that debate, in his book, Small is Still Beautiful. I think that's largely what he's trying to get at, is this type of an economy. When we compare that old school model, and then we compare the modern constant revolution,
Mm-hmm.
which is both a economic and political revolution, which is constantly in revolution.
Mm-hmm.
So I would agree that I mean, this is the part of the libertarian that we can all agree on. There's just big government is bad. I am very skeptical of the faith in the market
Mm-hmm.
to break up a monopoly, simply because the strong man is created, whether it's through big business or through big government.
Mm-hmm.
And a monopoly is able to, a big business can in fact control things, unless we're in this constant revolution, which is revolting against this dominance. But
Okay.
that's not really an ideal either.
Mm-hmm.
It's like, yeah, okay, I could agree that a monopoly might do that. It might not. But I would consider both of those options as not ideal, and not sort of this
So how
great
would you?
market system.
But and this is a real question. How do people think that we arrive at monopolies? Like, how would we arrive at the type of monopolies that we have without government intervention?
Well, the origin of it is, I would say, crony capitalism,
Which is definitely an interventionist type of capitalism. That's the thing. So, like, think about it this way. Let's use an example in the settling of America and Canada. At the beginning of something, there's always a monopoly on it. There was a monopoly on the railroad, for example. The railroads that went out west and stayed through Oregon and such, like through the territories and stuff. They were private. They were private contractors who the government paid essentially to build the railroads out there. And you can see even these fights back and forth of, them competing with each other, and you can't come my railroad, whatever. You can never avoid that. It doesn't matter, because when the government, for example, does something like settle the West, they hire a private contractor to do it. The government doesn't do anything. They just pay the private contractor, right? They're the middleman, basically paying the guy. You just cannot avoid, in some capacity, when something is especially new, you can't avoid having a monopoly in some capacity, because it's going to be the only person doing it. I mean, if you're the only one who knows how to make a telephone, then you're going to have a monopoly on making that until other people know how to make telephones. So I think in the last 100 years, 120 years especially, we've seen a very rare time in human history where we've seen invention after invention after invention that have radically changed the fabric of how we live. I mean, we went from, someone living in the 1700s lived more like someone in the year 700 than they did, 80 years later, or 200. That's a very unique. I actually, even the last 15 years or 20 years, I was thinking about this when I started teaching. I realized, you and I are born in the late 80s, and I had a life more similar to my no, God rest his soul. He didn't have television growing up, but I grew up without the internet until I was about high school. I mean, we didn't really have it. I just remember thinking I had more in common with the childhood that I had, TV aside, than I did with the students I was teaching, who at one point were only like 8 years younger than me. And I was like 25, and I was teaching 18-year-olds or something, in grade 12. And I thought, that's crazy. They've grown up in a different world than I have, with only a span of 8 years, 7, 8 years. In this time of crazy inventions and changes in life and globalization and all this sort of stuff, it's just been a monopoly after monopoly, because it's been new thing after new thing that has caught on like wildfire. But the problem is that all those things have caught on, and we've had these interventionist economies the whole time. And this is what a lot of these classic liberal, I know it's a bad word, but these sort of, we should maybe distinguish between, there's obviously a liberal in the religious sense, which is wrong. I mean, this is heretical nonsense. But then in the sense of even in France, for example, I was reading Bastiat last night. I was trying to understand what he was saying. and he can't stand the revolution. Like he's trying to figure out a way to go against this continual. I mean, he's writing in like 1846. I mean, he's seen 2 or 3 revolutions since then and bloodshed and stuff. And he uses the term liberal, though, because in his opinion, it was the French revolutionaries who weren't liberal because they ended up subjugating everybody to tyranny and so on and so forth. And these libertarian thinkers, they recognize, he was saying in 1848, 46, whenever he wrote it, that what would happen is this style of actual bad liberalism, this French revolutionary liberalism, would lead to these consistently interventionist economies, which would lead to monopolies, because it was cronyism par excellence. Cronyism and socialism are like the same thing. It's just that in one, getting rich is seen as a virtue, in the other, it's not. But it's still, the government is the thing that decides what contracts you're going to get and so on and so forth. So clearly you build these monopolies. So we've just basically seen, sadly, over the last 120 years, a mentality of cronyism with the new inventions which make monopolies. So the only solution to people in their minds has been the government has to break up the monopolies. But the reason we have monopolies is because of the government in the first place. So that's kind of what I think.
So basically, let me try to do it this way. Is in the traditional Catholic economy that grows out of the organic society, the restraint upon human greed is restrained primarily by custom, so that there is a moral society and people have oughts in their minds that you are not to transgress these different oughts, which are all custom and oral tradition. And so people naturally grow into these different cooperations that are also competitive, as we discussed, like guilds innovating and various innovations that were arising in the 1200s. There was innovations in agriculture and architecture, all sorts of different scientific discoveries, things like that was going on in a spirit of cooperation and competition. And the restraint on human greed was primarily by custom. Now, if there could be an intervention by the government, if you will, from on high, but that was not primarily the case of restraint. So it's sort of bottom up primarily, and so that's total subsidiarity. So that's really the ideal economy, the organic society that we're trying to talk about in terms of the ideal, in terms of Catholic social teaching. My concern is that the family, it takes 18 to 30 years to raise a family and pass down the faith to your children. So in a constantly revolting and revolutionizing economy, this type of thing can create instability for the family, because the family has to live somewhere for 30 years and be able to.
One sec. I just hear one of my kids. I got to run and grab one of my kids.
Oh, okay.
Quick. Yeah, I'll be back in a sec.
Oh, okay. Well, I'll make my dramatic point while you're gone then. But basically, my concern with this is that a subsistence economy should, if the economy and the society is based on the family as the irreducible social unit, it revolves around the family's needs, and it only innovates as fast as the family develops. And the family develops, every generation develops 18 to 30 years. It takes for a generation to grow up and raise and then interact with the economy. And you cannot have a stable community where everyone lives in the community, in the land, subsists off the land or off of the economy according to the geographical location. You can't have that if there's a constant revolution in the economy, where every new economic revolution is innovating so fast because of human greed. Human greed is the law of profits instead of the law of the home. And we live in the law of profits and power. That's the era that we live in, the law of profits and power. So whether it's profits or power or both, because profits give you power, and with power you can get profits. And so that's the principle of the economy in our era, so that they're going back and forth. Everyone's It's either interventionist economy with a larger government or a larger business. And so if we go back and forth where each side, like the big business is gaining more power and the big government's gaining more power, and they just have more power to fight with each other, that's a terrible situation that we're in. And that's exactly what it is. So if we restore things to the societies based on the family, that is going to that's what we're talking about here. Let me get into some questions while I'm just kind of running off here while Kennedy's gone. Where does the family's understanding of needs versus wants fit into your equation? That's a great question, Francis. It makes me think of I believe it was in the Catholic environmentalism book that I read by Thomas Stork, which is called Glory of the Cosmos. And they were talking about how, like, at least in the United States, people have so many wants that the economy cannot possibly satisfy the demand that every family has on all of the new innovations and new comforts and all these new things constantly becoming new, that the economy cannot even satisfy all of those things. And so the economy must be in constant revolution to satisfy every new desire and new comfort. And when you have, which is ultimately, that's sort of also a sort of a form of greed from the family, because greed infects and poisons not only the big government and the big business, but all the way to the human soul, the individual human soul. And so I think it is ultimately breaking down the family when we have this influx of greed. So Kennedy, I've just gone on and on. But
so okay, let me.
yeah.
I was thinking about something. My false alarm. Everything's fine.
Okay.
Okay. What were you saying when I just?
I mean, I was just saying, like, that there's basically the law of profits or power.
Yes, I agree.
It's like big governments expanding, so big business is expanding. I mean, the point is historically, you only broke the force of custom. You broke the force of organic Christian economy by means of power and profits, whether that's big business or big government. And they're just ever since then,
collectivism, and it's a collectivism in two ways.
and it's theft, taking land from the poor and everything. So and then it's business and big government just fighting each other for power, and that's what we have for 500 years.
That's right, exactly. Which is what the libertarian rejects. You know, this is two things here. I want a couple misconceptions people generally have. I think a lot of people believe that libertarian does not want to have a state at all. I think that's what they think. But this is not true. Okay. I've got something here from Mises, for example. And he literally says, the observance of the moral law is in the ultimate interest of every individual. Because everyone benefits from the preservation of social cooperation. Yet it imposes on everyone a sacrifice, even though only a provisional one, that is more than counterbalanced by a greater gain. To perceive this, however, requires a certain insight into the connection between things and to conform one's actions in accordance with the perpetual demands and a certain strength of will. Those who lack the perception or having the perception lack the necessary willpower to put it into use are not able to conform to the moral law voluntarily. The situation here is no different from that involved in the observance of the rules of hygiene that the individual ought to follow in the interest of his own well-being. Someone may give himself over to unwholesome dissipation, such as indulgence in narcotics, whether because he does not know the consequences or because he considers them less disadvantageous than the renunciation of the momentary pleasure, blah, 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 blah. There are people who consider that society is justified in resorting to coercive measures to set such a person on the right path and to correct anyone whose heedless actions imperil his own life and health. They advocate that alcoholics and drug addicts should be forcibly deterred from indulging their vices and compelled to protect their own good health. The question whether compulsion really answers the purpose is in such cases we shall talk about later in the book. What concerns us here is something quite different, namely the question whether people whose actions endanger the continued existence of society should be compelled to refrain from doing so. And he goes on to talk about how, of course, in some capacity, there has to be you have to be refrained from doing so. And he also talks about how anarchism is a dead end as well, because it's absurd. This idea that there can't be a state at all. In another spot, Mises, he says, there is not the slightest reason to object to the professional politicians and professional civil servants if the institutions of the state are democratic. And by democratic, he does not mean pure democracy. He's a huge critic of pure democracy. To be honest, his idea of democracy is kind of like Chesterton's sort of subsidiarity. But he says, but democracy is something entirely different from what the romantic visionaries who prattle about direct democracy imagine. So in the libertarian framework, there is, of course, a state. Meaning what? The state means the government. This is the distinction, for example, between a state and a nation. You can obviously have a nation within a state that's not the state, and you could have a state with no nations in it. Really, you could have sort of a place like, I don't know, Dubai or something. I don't know if we have a nation. It's more of an artificial place, but it's a state. So when you break it down to the base level, what is a state? A state is the government. Now that government can have more or less majesty to it, depending on how it operates. And that's another thing as well, is that, for example, if I'm reading, I have Bastiat's book open here, and he talks about, for example, it doesn't necessarily matter what form. He says, a government that could be imagined. He's talking about a type of government, whatever its political form might be. So he's saying here, and if a people established upon this basis were to exist, he's talking about people who basically follow the moral law. It seems to me that order would prevail among them in their acts as well as their ideas. It seems to me that such a people would have the most simple, the most economical, the least oppressive, the least to be felt, the most restrained, the most just, and consequently the most stable government that could be imagined, whatever its political form may be. So can be a monarchy, can be a republic, can be a representative, whatever. The libertarians reject the revolutionary framework. Now, often libertarians will appeal to the American Revolution, which, irrespective of the justification of the American Revolution, because there's a lot of holes in the mythology. It is a strong mythology, but there are holes in it nonetheless. The American Revolution was if we look at it, it was an English revolution within an English revolution. I mean, once England separated itself from Rome, it fell into errors that the church had always protected against. One of those errors, for example, is there's no separation of church and state in the Catholic concept, in this amorphous state and church never touch, because that's just impossible. People who are Catholic, if they're in the state, therefore your state's with your church somehow.
Yes.
But there was a distinction between church and state for the good of the church, because you don't want these errors of the state to be associated with the goodness of the divine mandate of the church. Henry VIII obviously destroys that by basically making the state and the church almost the same thing. If the king is going to be commissioning liturgy and commissioning changes to sacramental theology and having people go enforce those things, basically the religion is the state is religion, so on and so forth. And from there you have this that's the end of the English Empire, essentially. I mean, it gets massive after that, but you have the end of the goodness of the English thing, and perhaps your guest will talk about that in the next week or when he's on her. And the American Revolution is a revolt against a revolt, which is why it's such a mess to try to understand. And the mentality, at least, of the American revolutionaries, again, I'm not justifying the unjustifiable, but the mentality was, in the English state, you now had this mentality of interventionism that found its way in through taxes and so on and so forth. And the ideas of Bastiat, when he looks at the American Revolution, as he talks about it a bunch, and he talks about it before it got, he died in 1850, so he didn't see how things ended up. He didn't see the Civil War, which he would have hated, with basically the killing of your own people and so forth. And he says, the mentality was to protect against protectionism, which was in enshrining these certain rights that would protect you from what he saw in the modern age as this inevitable like that movie, the Thing, that would swallow everything up and get bigger. This inevitable big government mentality, because in a revolutionary age, it's collectivism that always wins the day. And that's sort of what the libertarians recognize. And, you know, someone in the comments said that we live in, the tech giants made monopolies without government intervention. It's actually not true, because at the most base level, the services that they use were already regulated. That's, for example, like if you say the government's not involved in internet, well, they are, because the internet's actually licensed across the country, et cetera. So there's really we can't conceive of a non-regulated economy now, because we just don't understand what that would be like. The true classic libertarian types and thinkers recognize that it's sort of like it's almost as if they saw the lockdown coming, and they said, whatever the good may be, the harm is going to be worse than the disease, and worse than the cure will be worse than the disease. And that's sort of how they view government intervention. Some libertarian thinkers don't think much about the family and their own personal thoughts. That's true. Some of them are just basically individualists. But when you read the libertarian literature, there's kind of two types. You read the sort of very dry, very scientific literature that is not really concerned with qualitative things too much. And then you read the commentaries on those things, and they always mention things like the families are destroyed, a husband can't provide for his family, those sorts of things. So yeah, that's the end of my tangent.
Okay, sure. I mean, I definitely, I usually read, the libertarians that I read are all the Catholics who are translating it into a Catholic frame of thought. And I guess I can get on board with, as I do in my book. I try to concede as much as possible to the libertarian thought, which I think there's a great deal to concede. In fairness, I think that in particular, I think the America, like I criticize America in my book quite a bit, but there's like Samuel Gregg has a book, Tea Party Catholic, all about how great America is, basically. But he points out how there's he calls the economy of liberty, which is where somebody like Overture to Toussaint, let's see, Toussaint from Haiti was able to, the saint was able to immigrate from Haiti to New York City and just create his own business. And that type of liberty, to be able to entrepreneurship, like the emphasis on entrepreneurship, especially entrepreneurship to help the poor, by libertarians, I think is absolutely a great point, a very, very important point. I have a problem with the libertarians when they start to place so much faith in the sort of this magic of the market, which seems to just, it seems in their rhetoric to believe that if we can just have a very, very small state and then just let the market just run unregulated, whether that's government intervention or just let monopolies happen, that it's this theological belief that God uses markets to sort of provide for everybody as much as possible. And I find that this lacks the consideration of original sin corrupting the market and corrupting the interactions between humans, between economies and economic interactions. Because it seems to me that the big government is a corruption, but big business is also a corruption, and they very much inform one another.
So let me read here. You're exactly correct. And I don't think that the serious libertarians, well, listen, I can't speak for anyone else because I don't know what anybody else thinks. I can see how it comes off to people that there is this belief in sort of this magic market. But I think this is partly true. This is something else I was thinking about, which ties into this. It's like this, there's this idea that libertarianism is amoral. And that's a distinction in terms, because an example I was thinking of was, imagine the COVID curtain was lifted and the Flanders family could make a trip across Lake Huron over to the Great Covid North. And, you and your wife wanted to go on a date night, and you say, I'm going to leave the kids with the Halls for the night. Great. Only charge you $50. And, but you get home and your kids say, Mr. Hall lets us do whatever we want. And you're like, what? That's not good. And you say, Kennedy. And I said, no. I said, no swearing, no cussing, no blaspheming, no food in the living room, whatever. Besides that, do whatever you want. Have a blast. It's like, oh, he didn't say you could do whatever you want. He just gave you a few basic rules and then said, go have fun. That's not the same thing as saying you can do whatever you want. With libertarianism, with the Austrian approach to economics, basically the 10 commandments that apply socially are applied. You can't steal, you can't plunder, you can't fraud, you can't bear false witness. That's basically what fraud is. And you can't aggress. I mean, thou shalt not kill is not just, with your examination of conscience, it's not just only murdering someone. It's you can't go and harm someone unintentionally and so on and so forth. There's actually a lot of restraint in what you're allowed to do as a libertarian, as an Austrian. From there, the thinkers will say, in this framework, the libertarian is not concerned with the moral decisions. But again, it's after establishing constraint in the first place. So some people will say, for example, libertarianism is amoral. It's not. It's just maybe not as moralistic as some would like it to be, but it's not amoral. And then that's a debate about effectiveness of legislating morality, and that's a whole other conversation. As far as the free market concerned, it's the free market within that framework. So you can't steal, you can't fraud, whatever, all these sorts of things. It's basically through looking at the Western canon of history and literature, they say, when do people function the best as a rule? They function the best as a rule when these things are restrained, which are criminal. And then from there, it's, again, this idea of the market will work out itself. It's more of human beings will work out their affairs. But there is not this idea that man is some noble savage. They're not Rousseauians. And here is Bastiat talking about this. And he's talking about the basic nature of law and what its purpose is. And he says the law has been perverted through the influence of two very different causes, naked greed and misconceived philanthropy. So here he's sort of critiquing the collectivist idea that there's the poor people. So the government's going to take all your money and go feed the poor people. And it's like, yeah, but you're not as good as the church at that. So why are you doing this? Or you're not as good as I am at that, and you create welfare. And then naked greed. So this is him. So this is the condemnation of an economy of only power without any common sense restriction on what a person's allowed to do. He says, let us speak to the former. Self-preservation and development is the common aspiration of all men, and in such a way that if everyone enjoyed the free exercise of his faculties and the free disposition of their fruits, social progress would be incessant, uninterrupted, inevitable. However, there is another disposition which is common to them. This is to live and to develop what they can at the expense of one another. This is no rash imputation examining from a gloomy, uncharitable spirit. History bears witness to the truth of it. By the incessant wars, the migration of races, sectarian oppressions, the universality of slavery, the frauds in trade, and the monopolies with which its annals abound. This fatal disposition has its origin in the very constitution of man, in that privative and universal and invincible sentiment that urges it towards its well-being and makes it seek to escape pain. And he goes on to talk about how the basic laws, let's call them the natural laws, would guard against this being able to be a thing. Now, here's the thing. He considers in his work government being the thing that guards against that. But he comes to the conclusion, as the libertarians do. You and I, Tim, talked. You said there's a temptation in economic transactions to take advantage of the weaker power. I agree, which is why I don't want the government to take advantage of me. So it's basically he doesn't use the word original sin. Bastiat did die a faithful Catholic, by the way. He's buried in Rome in a Catholic cemetery, and he died from consumption, tuberculosis. He was raised by a revolutionary. So he knew a caricature of the faith, realized revolution was stupid, and sort of was a natural law thinker. And then by the end of his life realized this is Catholicism. So he just didn't have enough. He wanted to write a book. He was writing a book that he didn't finish about how the Catholic teachings were in harmony with this idea of this market that he was thinking of. Anyway, but he died before he could finish it. So he's looking at this situation and going, if we want to guard against monopolies, we should probably guard against the biggest monopolies, which is the government. If we want to guard against basically people who are wounded through original sin, to use a term that especially Catholic, then we need to make sure that the people who are wounded against original sin can't take advantage of you. So if you're going to have a government, and I know this, I worked in the public school system for 7 years. Out of 100 people, maybe I met one or two that didn't think about their personal needs ahead of the needs of the system itself, or who didn't think about the system itself before the needs of the kids. That's not to say that they believed they were doing that, but that ultimately was the belief of the civil servants if you pushed them on it. This is so all of these same temptations to take advantage of people who are vulnerable will manifest itself in government. So all the Libertarian is saying is there are certain things where it makes it, relatively speaking, really difficult to take advantage of someone. And this is, you are in charge of making sure that people don't murder other people. You're in charge of making sure that people honor contracts. They're in charge of making sure that, you aren't allowed to steal someone's stuff. Basically, it's like there are sins, there are criminal activities that in a sense are politically and ideologically neutral. It's just wrong to steal something. We all agree on this. So the government stops that. But they just believe that this temptation, as you say, to take advantage of the weaker party, it's inherent in every transaction. And the government, if it's in charge of transactions, ultimately just is a temptation too great. And that's the crux of what it is, how people apply it, or how the belief that various libertarians have about what the state ought to be, the extent of the government. These things people can debate on, but that's the crux of it.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree that, big government is the problem. I agree. The government shouldn't be regulated in all these different transactions. But let's take it to the practical level. Sure. I'm a business owner, and I want to pay my employee. And with a libertarian framework, all I do is consult, well, what is the market paying? And therefore I will pay, or what is he willing to work for? So it's the criterion for justice in this case are solely the two parties, my will and his will. And I could take advantage of his will, like, in the early revolutions where you had families who were betting down the wages and trying to work for as little as possible. And this is just starvation wages, basically. Or the Catholic framework says, well, what is just? And so there's a third criterion, and we're not even talking about the government. Government's not even involved in this whole transaction. But when I am a business owner and I think, well, what is just? What is according to justice? Not just what I want, not just what he wants, but what is justice? So there's this third criterion. So I don't with the libertarian praise of the market.
So where do you see that is what you're saying? How do you do that? Right? Like, how does that happen?
Would you say that I'm not being economical or something?
No.
Justice in this transaction here?
No, and I'll use a practical example to try to illuminate exactly what you're saying, because I agree with you. And again, the revolutionary bidding down of the wages and so forth, a libertarian also rejects that, because revolutions are collectivist activities where the government becomes in charge of everything. This is the thing about revolutions. You know what? And this is going to get me in trouble with trads as well. I'm on a roll this week, aren't I? The last couple of weeks getting in trouble with them. Although this is kind of like the silent majority. A lot of trads, I get messages saying, I like what you're saying, but I didn't want to say it out loud. Hilaire Belloc gets criticized for sympathizing with the French Revolution. I think that's a misreading of Belloc. He believes that it was inevitable because not all was good. What happened before the French Revolution in France? The monarchs ignored Christ.
Yeah.
Right. So, his basically the anthropological view, let's call it that, just sort of looking at, again, the way that the peoples work. France was in a bad way, and men were, through their woundedness of sin and so on and so forth, they were open to being caught up in the winds of change, the winds of revolution. And they did. But it was a collectivist response to a collectivist problem. Hence why we have this continual back and forth. I mean, that's modern politics. It's our big government will be better for you than their big government. It's like, oh, great. That's fun. So let's use a practical example, because this is something, and can we speak for like maybe 10 minutes longer today?
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. Okay. So this just wage thing, this is a really hard thing to define. Let's take a practical example. I start a brewery, and I have a microbrewery that serves X amount of people. For my business model to work, I need 6 employees. I need 2 guys to be the night brewers. I need 1 guy to be delivery driver. I need 2 people in the daytime, whatever, figure it out. Now, the way that the math works for my brewery, based on what people are willing to pay for it, based on the prices of the products and all these sorts of things that I just have to work out as a businessman, I can hire 6 people for about $35,000 a year. Now, $35,000 a year is not enough for a man to support his family. Although we could argue that in a world without income tax, it might be. But $35,000 a year is not enough in our type of world to support your family, generally speaking. But even there's a catch. Because, again, what does it mean to support your family? There is no Catholic teaching on how you're supposed to live as a family insofar as what material things you ought to have. If we all were to take stock of our finances and basically cut down things immensely, we might be able to support a family on $35,000, $40,000 a year if we lived in an apartment. I'm not saying that you should do that. I'm just saying that is a theoretical possibility, which for some people they like. They come from some third world country that's war torn, and they live in an apartment building, and it's paradise on earth, and they drive a taxi and make 40 grand a year and have a blast. I don't know. So someone might say, well, you can't support a family working at your brewery. And I say, yeah, I'm not trying to hire a family man. I can't. My business model is that I need these people working in order to get the product to thing. And I've got to do this for 5 or 7 years probably before I can give raises and do whatever. Otherwise, it's just not going to work, and I'm going to go under. So if somebody decides to work there and has a family, they come to me and say, well, I don't get paid a just wage. It's like, I can't pay you more. Otherwise, I'm going to have to shut the thing down in general. So whatever your reasons were for working for me, you knew you were going to have a side hustle or a job on Saturdays as well in order to make that extra, or your wife's going to have to work part-time or whatever it was. So the Libertarian believes that the Austrian believes as far as what the just wage will be. In a world without the regulations from the government, in a world without interventionism, these conversations are naturally going to happen between employees without minimum wage. Too, minimum wage is terrible for the poor. These conversations are going to happen. And this idea that the market works itself out, it's not that the market works itself out as some metaphysical, magical thing that just invisible hand. Also, the Austrians ultimately reject Adam Smith's almost materialist view of, or his basically alchemist view or something, whatever it was of the economy. This idea that the invisible hand works irrespective of human behavior is rejected by the Austrians. So even if I'm a Catholic and I'm thinking, how can I have a just wage that is entirely subjective? I agree with you, but I've asked traditionalists before, like, where is the teaching, for example, on what I'm supposed to pay someone? It's a silly question, because there is no teaching on what you're supposed to pay someone. You can only pay the person what you can pay the person. This is going to happen whether or not you have a regulated economy or an unregulated economy. Certain industries will require certain employees, certain jobs will be able to pay for families, and some will not. And that will always be the way that it is. So the libertarian is looking at this and going, this is the valley of tears, to use a Catholic term. This is a world of, even the New Catechism says, there is a natural inequality that will be here till the end of time. The poor will always be with us, as Christ says. So the problem is that we recognize these things are the case, and that there will always be people in poverty, which is literally what God himself said. The government makes it harder to alleviate that poverty because it takes your money away. You can't do as much charity. It puts restrictions on what your church isn't allowed to do. And I'm talking about our modern state. And it artificially raises the wages through minimum wage, for example, which means, let's just, like, people go after libertarians because they think they support child labor. I'll tell you what, I had a job when I was 7 years old, and it was at my dad's apartment building that he lived at, and I cleaned washing machines on the weekend for like 4 hours. I got paid $10 to clean the two buildings. Now, I don't know what the hourly wage, I probably worked for 2 or 3 hours or something. It was $10. Now, that was for me something my dad got for me just as a way to learn responsibility and stuff, and it was great. But if I lived in a third world nation, $10 a week for me, or whatever the equivalent could be, it could be 30% of our groceries. You know, when you think about buying beans and rice and all that sort of stuff, it could have been something that I had to contribute to the household economy. When the government makes that sort of thing illegal, they put more pressure on the dad to be the sole provider, for example, without this organic interplay with the various, because no one's going to go want to clean washing machines for $10 for 2 hours of work, except if you're 7 or 8 years old and it's just something that you can do where you can spend a couple hours. So my point is, we'll always have the poverty. We'll always have the injustice. There will always be people trying to take advantage of other people, because there's always going to be original sin. There will always be a valley of tears. We'll always have the poor, as Christ says. At least in the libertarian framework, it is at the smallest level, the people can work it out amongst themselves, and the government does not restrict the people of goodwill in wanting to use their money for good causes. And the government doesn't take your money and say, we deem these are the right causes. So when I engage with the integralist who says, I agree, I just don't see where there's a difference between, for example, the way that you and I think. Because even if you were going to say, well, the government should act for the poor, we would probably agree that the government should act for the poor in a way that the church would agree that the should act for the poor, which means it has to be charity. Well, when the government starts acting for the poor and giving the poor money, for example, it's no longer charity, it's welfare. And that's just a disaster after, we've seen this story as old as time. So I agree with you that the justice thing is a problem. I just think that the libertarian framework is the most practical way to deal with that. That is all.
Okay. Well, we're all out of time. And I will say this, Kennedy, you are certainly more palatable for me than most of the libertarians that I have read myself. I typically, the libertarians that I've read, I have a hard time countenancing their arguments, but I think there's a great deal of common ground, and certainly a common effort against the Marxists. So we're all against the Marxist Uber state. So,
can't stand them.
So let's offer up a Pater Noster. Stay tuned for this Thursday patron only show, Jews, Judaism, and Israel. I forgot to mention we're talking about the Jewish virtue of hatred. The Jewish virtue of hatred. Very important topic to talk about. So this Thursday, and then make sure you sign up for the Kennedy Profession. That's every day from 3 to 5 p.m. Eastern Time talk show from Kennedy. So let's offer up a Pater Noster, and there we go. Nomine Patris et Filii et Spiritus Sancti. Amen. Pater Noster, qui es in caelis, sanctificetur nomen tuum, adveniat regnum tuum, fiat voluntas tua sicut in cielo et in terra.
Panem nostrum quotidianum dat nobis hodie, et dimitte nobis debita nostra, sicut et nos dimittimus debitoribus nostris, et ne nos inducas in tentationem, sed libera nos a malo. Amen.
Nomine Patris et Filii et Spiritus Sancti. Amen. Jesus is King.